Will the real Vladimir Putin please stand up? Today we're going to do some forensic analysis and determine whether the Vladimir Putin at the Alaska meeting was the real Vladimir Putin. And luckily we have several relatively high resolution photos that we can actually analyze. The photo you see on the screen right now was taken at the Alaska summit, and it's probably the highest resolution photo I have ever seen taken of a president. I mean, look at this. You can literally see his pores. But that's actually a good thing because that's going to make it easier for us to do our analysis. Now, if you ask me, like if I saw this man on the street, I wouldn't have even recognized him as Vladimir Putin. So if you would have asked me during the conference whether it was him or not, I would have told you no way. Like, this guy doesn't even look like Vladimir Putin. But as it turns out, the forensics kind of tell a completely different story. So the first thing that sort of jumped out at me was this slightly darker patch in the iris of his left eye. You can clearly see that there's a patch that's darker than the rest of the iris, and it's just to the left of the bottom of his iris. So let's look at some older photos or past photos of Putin and see if this dark spot right here appears in other photos. So the first photo I found was during a speech he made last year for National Women's Day in Russia, and you can clearly see that same dark patch, okay? It's a little bit less pronounced, but it's in exactly the same place as in that first photo at the summit. It's actually surprisingly a little bit more noticeable when you zoom out than when you're zoomed in for whatever reason. Here's a much older photo of Putin. You see that same little dark patch just to the left of the bottom of his left eye's iris. Now let's take a look at some of his wrinkles. So wrinkles tend to, of course, change over time, but as you'll see, the characteristics of those wrinkles stay relatively consistent, especially if the photos are only a few years apart. So once again, looking at the photo from the Alaska summit. So the first unique characteristic that I spotted in his wrinkles are in the wrinkles of his forehead, and specifically the wrinkles over his left eyebrow. Now you can clearly see that there's a wrinkle here and there's a small space and a little bit of an overlap where that second wrinkle begins. And another thing I noticed was that this wrinkle does not really connect to this wrinkle right over here, whereas the next one, it does connect and it has this sort of bird wing structure. So if we go to this photo taken from the Kremlin last year, here we see it quite clearly. This one sort of overlaps with this one, okay, in that same kind of pattern and with that same characteristic. Also, this wrinkle does not connect with this wrinkle, whereas the one right above it, it does connect and it has that same overall shape. We see that same pattern in a much older photo of Putin. You can tell that even though the wrinkles are not as pronounced, you can still definitely see that divide between these two wrinkles. We have this one, and then this one is overlapping slightly. It doesn't really connect to this wrinkle, whereas this one is already connected and it has that wing-like structure. Moving on to sort of the middle of his face, we see that under his left eye, he has these two wrinkles going down like this and a more faint wrinkle sort of overlapping those two, kind of like a strike, okay? And something else I noticed was that here there's a wrinkle that kind of goes all the way across his nose up here, whereas this wrinkle just above that only goes about halfway to the left. Another thing I noticed was this sort of sideways V-shaped wrinkle over here. You'll see that those wrinkles, although less pronounced in his earlier years, you do see those wrinkles already appearing. Namely here, once again, this is 17 months ago at a speech on Women's Day in Russia. You can see this one stops about halfway, whereas this one goes more or less all the way across. We also have that same exact wrinkle pattern here, where these two wrinkles are kind of parallel, and a more faint wrinkle. It's even more faint here because he's 17 months younger, as well as this V-shaped wrinkle here. I'm just going to delete these lines so you can inspect for yourself. But perhaps the most telling are these three wrinkles on his lower lip toward the middle. You can see very clearly that there's sort of two wrinkles that are not quite a straight line, but they're curved out slightly. And there's a smaller wrinkle right over here that's actually quite deep, but it stops right about here. So it's in the middle toward the top, and we have these two slightly curved out wrinkles, and they're pretty much exactly in the middle of his bottom lip. And if we go to this photo taken 17 months ago, you can clearly see the same two wrinkles with the same shape, slightly curved outwards, exactly in the middle, and with this very small wrinkle just at the top of the bottom lip. Here's another photo from 2022. You can see now it's incredible how much he has aged just in the last 4 years. So you can clearly see how stressful the war has been on Putin. He looks like he's aged at least 10 years in the last 4 years. And once again, even in this photo, we see all of those characteristics. Namely here, we can clearly see these two overlapping wrinkles above his left eyebrow. This wrinkle does not connect with the wrinkle on the other side, whereas the wrinkle above that does connect, and it follows that wing-like pattern. And here you can definitely see this wrinkle that kind of stops halfway through, whereas this one goes more or less all the way across. And at this point, he's just starting to develop those wrinkles on his lips, with these two on the outside and this one in the middle that kind of stops halfway down. Now, these types of characteristics are very difficult to reproduce with plastic surgery. Sort of another data point is we're seeing how these characteristics of Putin's wrinkles are sort of changing and adapting over time with age. So that's sort of another data point that points to it being the actual Putin at the summit. Something else that some people have mentioned is the Putin at the summit seems to not have much of a chin. But I've looked at several photos of Putin in the past, and he hasn't had much of a chin for at least a decade. So if we look at, for example, this photo, this was taken in 2016, almost 10 years ago. Not much of a chin there. I mean, there might be just this slight indentation, but really apart from that, there's not much of a chin. And if we compare sort of the overall shape of his chin itself, I think his chin looks very similar to his chin at the summit. I've also looked at a lot of pictures of Putin's hands in previous years and other photos, and his hands also look very consistent in their overall shape, proportions, and the characteristics of his fingernails and fingertips. So here's a photo from the summit, and here's a photo from 2019 with the same kind of fingernails, the same kind of thick fingers. And actually, something I just noticed now, although this is a pretty grainy image, we have this wrinkle that's a bit lower than this one, that little bit of overlap, as well as the fact that these two wrinkles don't connect, and then the one right above that does. And although that is, something that's somewhat common, I think when you take all of these data points together, it definitely points to it being the real Putin. And actually, one more thing that I forgot to cover. Putin has this very deep sort of divot under his bottom lip that is definitely common, but once again, that's another data point. And his looks like it's definitely more pronounced than average. Most people don't have a divot that's this narrow and this deep above their chin and beneath their bottom lip. And we do see that characteristic in the photo at the Alaska summit. Here it is. So I've actually analyzed a lot more photos than what you saw in this video, and I'm very confident that it was the real Putin at the summit. You can look at older photos yourself. There's a lot more data points that I haven't covered just for the sake of time. But there are a lot more consistencies in other parts of his face when you compare, for example, this photo in front of you to older photos of Putin. So I definitely wouldn't recognize Putin if I saw him on the street today. I mean, maybe I would, but this just goes to show you just how much people change as they age, particularly when they get into their 70s. So let me know what you think. If you want to see more cool videos like this, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.